Hi, I'm Bill Kristol. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined today by my friend Jack Goldsmith, who's a veteran of, I think, 3 of these conversations. Is that right? And
I think so.
very much looking forward to this fourth one. Jack is professor of law at Harvard, obviously served in the Bush administration and the Defense Department, and then as Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel. Author of many books, important student of separation of powers, executive power, and so forth. Has a new book out, which I should certainly plug, co-authored with Bob Bauer, President Obama's White House counsel, called After Trump, Reconstructing the Presidency, which we'll touch on some of those themes too. But Jack, we discussed actually 3 years ago, I think almost, what's today, September 21st, so I think it was October 3 years ago, the beginnings of the Trump presidency and how much damage would or wouldn't be done to the rule of law and to our institutions and our norms. And now we're near the end of the Trump presidency, or well, the end of the first term of the Trump presidency, at least. And I thought we should revisit that and sort of get your judgment on what do we make of it all? Are our institutions hanging by a thread, or are things basically fine and people are too hysterical, or what's the story? That we can go into some detail on some of these particular institutions. That makes sense?
Makes sense.
Okay, and we're doing this by Zoom, obviously, and you're teaching by Zoom this term, I gather?
I am, yes.
How's that going?
So far, so good. I'm only teaching a seminar. It hasn't been very challenging technologically yet.
Oh, that's good. That's good. But you have a big lecture course next term?
I have a 100-person lecture course in the spring, so that'll be more complicated.
That will be, yeah, that'll be interesting to hear how that goes. And, okay, so give me your sort of general judgment when people look back at this 4-year period. What will they say about?
So one of the things I think is when they look back in this 4-year period, what they will say about it and whether institutions were diminished, destroyed, or bucked up, and whether they withstood the onslaught of Trump, which we can talk about if you want. And a lot of that's going to depend on what happens next. A lot of that is going to depend on what comes in the next 4 years, whether, and I mean both in terms of what the next administration, assuming that Trump loses in the fall, what the next administration does in response to his norm breaking, and also not only in terms of institution building, but also in terms of how they comport themselves, whether they're not norm compliant or whether they basically continue what I see as a kind of tit for tat norm violations kind of spiraling out of control in Washington. So a lot of it's going to depend on what happens next. My general judgment is when we spoke 3 years ago, I was on the, I think it's fair to say, non-hysterical side of the worry about what was going on with the rule of law and the Justice Department. I'm actually still probably on that end of things in the sense that I think norms have worked much more consequentially than people think. But on the other hand, I've written a 400 some odd page book about the damage Trump has done to the presidency and what needs to be done afterwards. So clearly, I think there's work to be done.
So I want to get to, of course, what should happen and could happen next, but let's talk a little bit about the damage that has and hasn't been done. Which institutions of, I mean, we could begin with the different parts of the executive branch, or maybe that's the best place to begin, especially the Justice Department, which you're so familiar with. I mean,
sure.
Is that, so to speak, held up, and the things we institutionally and then in terms of norms as well?
Right. So I think so, more than people think, but obviously not completely. The place to begin has to be with President Trump, because he is the proximate cause of all the problems, in the sense that he is a kind of out of control norm breaker. Just everything he's done vis-a-vis the Justice Department and law enforcement has been in defiance of norms that held not perfectly, but remarkably well for the last 45 years since basically the post-Watergate reforms, post-Vietnam, post-Church Commission reforms of the 1970s. And, you know, it's a long list and it's a familiar list, but basically with regard to the Justice Department, you know, expressing the view that he can do whatever he wants because he's got the Article 2 power, viewing the lawyers in the Justice Department as his personal lawyers, urging the Justice Department on many occasions, with respect to almost a dozen different people, to basically investigate and prosecute his enemies, commenting on ongoing investigations involving his political enemies, Basically all of these things are hugely corrosive to the rule of law and violate norms that presidents respected. Again, not perfectly, but almost perfectly for 45 years. So that's the background. And in other words, this is a defiance by the chief executive of the norms that have defined the executive branch. So it's not going to be a perfect situation just in virtue of that. So the question is how the Justice Department is held up. So I generally think it's held up better, and the norms have held up better than many people do. And I'll just give you some examples. When we spoke I think in 2017, it wasn't clear how well norms were operating. The president was attacking the Mueller investigation. He was urging his political appointees to basically stop it. There was a very widespread sentiment that Mueller wasn't going to be able to finish his work. He wasn't going to be able to get the report out, and he did. And he did that because basically the Justice Department stood behind him. He did that because, quite remarkably, his political appointees in the White House and the Justice Department wouldn't carry out his wishes to get rid of Mueller. The volume 2 of the Mueller report is replete with examples of his closest aides basically ignoring him when he said, get rid of Mueller, get Sessions back in there, remove the recusal and the like. And it's kind of a remarkable thing. And in context, people didn't think that was going to work, and it did work. And that's a testament to these norms and also the laws. I mean, it's pretty clear that people in the White House, the subordinate officials, were worried about obstruction of justice. It's kind of vaguely defined, but there was that, and then there were the norms that have been embedded in the culture really for 45 years. So that's an example of things working remarkably well. And I think on the whole, the Justice Department didn't prosecute his enemies. They didn't basically carry out any of his wishes with regard to all of these things. Now, if we just stop there, the story is a mixed one. It's a story of a president who is, doing everything he can to basically defy and damage the institution, and to his political appointees in a remarkably difficult circumstance, basically trying to do the right thing. Then, and also in the interim, Bill Barr becomes Attorney General. Now, the period when we were talking, it was, I think Sessions was the Attorney General, but he was recused in the Russian investigation, and Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, was acting as the acting Attorney General for that purpose. So Bill Barr became Attorney General, and things have gotten different since then. It's a mixed judgment here. I mean, Barr came in. I've been disappointed with Barr as Attorney General, in the sense that I think that people have somewhat overreacted to him. I mean, the overreaction to Barr is so extreme, and he's really turned into something of a gaslighter in his speeches, directly confronting his political opponents and getting involved in politics as it relates to law enforcement, which is amazing. So he's done a number of things. Do you want me to go through them? I mean, yeah, well, I don't know how you want to.
No, this is important, I think. So what 2 or 3 things alarm you the most, both in terms of their actual effects or their prospective, norm setting effects?
Yeah. So I'll give you a couple examples of the most concerning things, and then I'll give a couple of examples where the norms have held even under Barr. So Barr has, as everybody knows, has a very broad view of Article 2. He has a very broad view of the president's ultimate authority. He has a very broad view, probably correct on the law, about his control over the Department of Justice. So the 2 things that he's done in general that are most concerning are, one, the actions he has taken with regard to the fruits of the Mueller investigation. And I'm thinking specifically of the effort to abrogate the Flynn conviction, the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, his efforts to reduce the sentence of Roger Stone. Those were, but we could talk about the merits. The merits of the Stone matter, I think, were kind of a close question. There was a very broad sentence that was recommended. It probably wouldn't have gotten that sentence if he weren't Roger Stone. Barr thought it was too broad, and he exercised his prerogative power to step in and change the sentence recommendation. And from a hard power perspective, he can do that. From a norms perspective, it looks like the Attorney General is carrying water for the president to help one of his friends who was basically involved in an effort possibly to protect the president. And so it looks terrible in appearance. And appearance is almost as important as reality here. So, and then the Flynn matter was a very unusual intervention by the Attorney General. Again, it's not, he's not violating any hard law restrictions, but definitely just utterly disregarding the appearances of intervening to help the president's pal. Now, Barr is clearly
And
himself.
those two really are unusual, right? It seems to be. I mean, there would have been a lot of pressure not to do that, it seems to me, in previous administration.
Well, what's unusual about it is two things. The Attorney General doesn't get involved typically in this level of individual prosecutions, first point. And second point is he, again, this is a norm, it's not a law, but he wouldn't have gotten involved, and this is a delicate thing, but he wouldn't have gotten involved in such an overt kind of course-changing way with regard to something that had been so controversial and so close to the president. So it was extremely unusual.
And where the president had sort of implied that, you know, he would take care of his friends, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean,
exactly. Well, this is the part, and I want to get to some the parts where norms worked in a second. But yes, this is the problem. Barr may well have been doing. I mean, if I had to guess, I'm pretty confident that Barr is not carrying the president's water in the sense of taking orders from him. If I had to guess, I would think that Barr thinks he's been convinced that there was wrongdoing in the run-up to these prosecutions. He's made this pretty clear. And he thinks the department overstepped itself in a way that he believed was illegitimate, and he was going to take steps to push back. I don't agree with that, but that's clearly the way Barr sees it. But when the president of the United States is the beneficiary, and when the president of the United States has been urging this publicly for a long time, it's impossible for it not to seem deeply politicized. And Barr must have anticipated that. He just didn't care. I mean, he has a very much of a hard power view, and the norms for him are less important. So that was one matter. Another matter is the Durham investigation, which he opened to investigate basically the investigation of the Trump campaign. So we have investigators of Barr. John Durham is a U.S. attorney in Connecticut. He's a reputable person. He was employed by Attorney General Holder to look into the Bush era interrogation matters in a narrow way. So he had credibility coming into this. Now, the investigation is somewhat unusual, not unprecedented. It's questioned why it wasn't done by an inspector general instead of a prosecutor. We now know that at least in part, Durham is open to criminal investigation. The truth is we don't know much about the details of the Durham investigation. There are lots of news reports based on lots of unnamed sources. But Barr himself has, in violation of the norms and rules, actually, of the department, has had a running public commentary that basically prejudges the whole thing. That basically has said there was wrongdoing and he's not sure what the consequences are, but there need to be consequences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he's, in a way, he's delegitimated no matter what Durham finds, and interjected himself into this most contested and political of things in a way that's not appropriate for an attorney general to do. People are under investigation and he's prejudging their cases. Barr gave a speech last week at Hillsdale College on Constitution Day when he talked about the importance of the prosecutor not being political, being scrupulously even-handed, and et cetera. And he was criticizing line attorneys, but that criticism applies directly, squarely to him. And he seemed oblivious to that. And he seemed oblivious to that throughout these episodes. So those are probably the two most concerning areas. And then the more general atmospherics of him seeming to be, basically protecting or helping the president. But there have been examples where, the norms have actually stuck, even when Barr has been attorney general. I'll give you two. One, he just lost his temper once when the president was, right after he intervened in the Flynn matter. The president tweeted out his congratulations to Barr, basically saying, congratulations to the attorney general for doing the right thing. Well, this just makes Barr look like, Barr does not see himself as a lackey, but he clearly looks like a lackey. And he went on to ABC News and he basically pushed back pretty hard against the president, said the tweets have to stop. I can't conduct these things fairly he didn't quite use these words, but with the appearance of fairness if I'm going to be being undermined by the Justice Department. Pretty remarkable statement at the time. I thought he may have been on the verge of resigning, and that didn't happen. And he hasn't followed up like that. The other example was when Trump tried to fire the acting U.S. attorney, Jeffrey Berman, in the Southern District of New York, who is obviously supervising some investigations that implicate the president. And they tried to put in one of the president's friends, the chairman of the SEC. I can't remember his name.
Right.
And there was a huge pushback, and Barr had to back down, and Barr had to put in his first assistant, and Barr issued a statement at the time talking about the importance of the appearance of neutrality, saying if there's any wrongdoing here, we'll have the Inspector General do it. It was a remarkable come down for him in the face of these norms about political interference in a potential investigation of the president. So those are the worst things Barr's done. He's done other things that have gaslighted people with a lot of his speeches about various things, but that doesn't answer the question about how the institutions are going to hold after the presidency, but that's basically the way I see it.
So and I think in the Berman case, it was also that they didn't think through the mechanics of replacing Berman, and so it turned out it was not so easy to move someone over laterally, and then
the vacancies. The vacancies rules really didn't permit easily this type of shift. And it was a remarkable incompetence on Barr's behalf, and he hadn't even thought through the legal issues fully, and probably revealing his cast of mind in terms of Article 2, we can do what we want within the executive branch.
Yeah, that is striking. So I want to get to maybe a couple of other agencies, but so the Justice Department, I think, if I hear you right, I guess we don't know yet. We'll see what happens with whether they announce preliminary findings of the Durham investigation before the election, which would be extremely, I think, unusual. And
yes,
we'll see how Barr conducts himself if there are election-related controversies. He certainly waded into the vote by mail stuff, for example, in a way that seems to be very. What does he know about vote by? I mean, he doesn't know any more than you and I do about it. And
I mean, on the one hand, the Attorney General is allowed to express views, and Attorney Generals also often express views about outstanding legal issues that are of concern to the Attorney General and what might be done about it. On the other hand, I haven't followed this as closely, but it sounds like he hasn't been talking straight about it or with full information. And so he's muddled the waters there too. I mean, Barr is a very smart and very sophisticated guy, and he knows the department. And I believe him when he says he loves the department. I actually think he really does love the department, and he probably thinks he's doing what's right for the department. But interjecting himself into these political disputes in ways that look political has not served that goal at all.
Now let's talk a little bit about other parts of the federal government. I mean, we have the Defense Department. There have been controversies, of course, there and pushback there. DHS, Homeland Security, maybe the most seemingly, I don't know, they didn't have very long established norms, so it's a little different, but a lot of stuff there that one could raise questions about. Obviously, the whole Ukraine matter raised issues about the conduct of foreign policy. And I think in each of those cases, correct me if I'm wrong, in different ways, you see the institutions sort of holding and sort of being chipped away at. And
again, so I would just, it's not a disagreement, but I would just reframe it differently. Whether the institutions are being chipped away at really depends on what comes next. Whether the norms have been complied with, I mean, you can have norm compliance and norm breach, and then the norms snap back when you have the next actor comes along. But yeah, in all those cases, there have been problems. I mean, there was, in DHS in general, Trump has basically hollowed it out. This is really an issue about vacancies reform. He's really, I can't even keep up with how hollowed out the top parts of the DHS are, but they have very thin leadership at the top. He's obviously, starting with the immigration proposal at the beginning of the administration's obviously tried to use DHS aggressively to carry out his wishes, which is the president's prerogative to do. But it seems like it's a politicized and dysfunctional agency, pretty much to the extent that there are political officials there running it. DOD, they got involved in a very deeply unfortunate way in the Lafayette Square matter, and in marching over the president to the church and appearing to be on the verge of using the Insurrection Act to bring the military into the homeland. That was, again, another Trump threat. This is characteristic, a threat of something that is really pretty extreme and concerning coming from him, and they didn't follow through. And I think it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and maybe the Secretary of Defense who both apologized and said it was inappropriate for them to be doing that. But the signal that sent was, terrible. What was the other agency you mentioned?
Well, the Ukraine's
the Ukraine matter. So John Bolton, a man I've known a long time and admire, is not a progressive person. And he referred, by watching in connection with the Ukraine matter and with a whole bunch of other things, with Trump basically using law enforcement to serve his personal ends. In his memoir, Bolton described Trump as appearing to basically engage in obstruction of justice as a way of life. That was the phrase. It's a remarkable phrase coming from Bolton. He knows what he's talking about when he says that. He was a senior Justice Department official. And, the Ukraine matter was a matter, it's not clear whether it violated, it pretty clearly violated the laws on appropriations and when you could and couldn't fail to issue the appropriation. The GAO came out with a report saying it violated that. Whether it violated other laws is not clear. It's not clear it would really be an obstruction of justice case, but it's completely outrageous for the president to basically, in that kind of crass, obvious, open way, and according to Bolton, on multiple occasions, he mentions this type of behavior in his memoir, to be, using the foreign policy apparatus to serve either personal grudges or to help him in a very concrete way harm his opponent. And Bolton suggests in his memoir that's been going on a lot.
Yeah, I was struck for Bolton. In real time before the memoir, when he was in government, he said famously, I guess Fiona Hill came to him and told him about what had been proposed, what was going on with Sondland and all that. And Bolton said, I don't want to be involved in that drug deal, colorfully, and then told her to go see the White House attorney. And I remember at the time when that came out during impeachment, I mean, Bolton had been as a lawyer, had been a senior person of justice.
Yeah.
As you say, it's not a shrinking violet in terms of presidential power and so forth. For him to tell one of his deputies, you better go memorialize this with a White House lawyer and stay away from this. I mean, that is pretty, the national security advisor, the president of the United States, to say that to one of his subordinates is pretty startling. And it's not just Bolton afterwards getting back at Trump. That was in a real-time development, so to speak.
I completely agree. And he did wait until the memoir to tell us his view that Trump lived obstruction of justice as a way of life, but it's pretty clear that's what he was thinking in that episode. And again, it's not clear if he was using that it's saying that Trump committed crimes, because there's a technical legal question whether the president can be subject to the obstruction of justice statute, but he was clearly abusing the office, mixing or confounding personal interest with public duty, which has been a characteristic of the Trump presidency.
And I guess one of the striking things about all these agencies really is, or most of them at least, and the White House in particular, I'd say, is the people who were, let's just say, mostly norm upholders early on are gone. I mean, that's literally true in Ukraine. I think you look at Trump didn't achieve his goal because the ambassador didn't go along, the Ambassador Yovanovitch, the new ambassador, Bill Taylor, didn't go along, the State Department types balked, Bolton himself balked, and eventually he sort of yielded in a sense. His end run with Giuliani and Sondland around the system didn't work. But of course, all those people are now gone. And the same is true at DHS, where we don't know exactly, but it does seem that Secretary Kelly and then Nielsen stopped certain things, which aren't being stopped now. And as you say, Barr has gone further than Sessions.
Right.
I mean, I suppose we're so late, there's no point speculating what could happen in the next 6 weeks. But it does seem to me to suggest that a second term of Trump presumably would continue to go in this direction of would not look like the first year or two of the second term of Trump would not look like the first year or two of the first term of Trump.
I completely agree with what you're saying. Trump has actually been rather incompetent at wielding executive power, figuring out the levers of the bureaucracy to really achieve his ends. And, he hired a bunch of people early on who were basically, it has never happened in the presidency, in the history of the presidency. So many senior officials basically not carrying out the president's orders, ignoring him, saying, I won't do it, or just dropping it. And you had a lot of people who were experienced government hands who were basically, more or less complying with the norms. Over time, he's definitely gotten better at either not appointing people or appointing people who are more on board and more compliant. And even then, he's not been terribly successful in achieving some of the crazy ends he says he wants to achieve. But you're absolutely right that the people now are more compliant. He's able to get his way more. He's figured it out more. He's shifted towards some hard power exercises that are easier to implement, like the pardon power, for example. And I agree, in a second term Trump presidency, we can expect much, much more of the same. I mean, there have been times, I think, when, at times in the Mueller investigation, when Trump was threatening to get rid of Mueller, when members of his party in the Senate especially, either quietly or publicly pushed back saying that's going too far, and he seemed to pull up short. And there's an implicit and political angle there. There's no political check at all on Trump after he wins, and I do think that we can expect these things to grow much worse.
If he wins, presumably he's also emboldened and feels like
Right.
he's been vindicated and stuff.
Right.
One last thing, maybe looking back, and then let's look forward. Congress, separation of powers. So we've talked about the internal operations of the executive branch, including the White House. And incidentally, just one more thing on that. I mean, I suppose there's a price to be paid, of course, for what you said, somewhat praising people, I think, incorrectly in my view, which was they didn't follow certain orders. But that's not a great model of governance either, in a way, right? I mean, they were right in these instances, I suspect. I mean,
that's actually a tough question. It's a tough question. I mean, you mean to address this now, or do you want to wait till later to address this?
No. I mean, just me that once you get this kind of, it sort of creates a predicate for. I mean, I think people could be doing the exactly right thing in all these cases, whether it's McGahn or certainly the ambassador and so forth, Yovanovitch and stuff. But it also is a heck of a way to try to maintain norms to have to ignore the president of the United States.
Well, we have some examples in the book. Just skipping ahead for a second, where it rates a hard question, because we have some examples in the book with some Justice Department officials who basically were so alarmed by Trump that they took matters into their own hands and didn't follow the norms, and that created problems on its own. This is your point. You don't want a system where senior officials aren't listening to and are defying the president. And it's hard to defend in the abstract. Basically, the people in the White House that I'm thinking about that didn't go to the Justice Department and basically order Rosenstein to fire Mueller, basically McGahn, White House counsel Don McGahn, and people like that. I mean, he was taking that step and he knew he could be fired for it, and that would have been the right way to do it. But Trump is so fleeting and he loses focus so quickly. And apparently you can tell this from all the Trump books, this is just a practice of the White House, that the president says crazy things and many times they ignore them, either because it's illegal or norm violative or just dead plain crazy. And so you do have this presidency. This is something I've been marked on since 2017, that it's one of the distinguishing characteristics is the extent to which people just ignore the president. And as you say, he's gotten better at finding people who are compliant. But coming up with a general theory of when it's okay to ignore the president and when not, and when it's okay to violate those norms and when not, is very tricky.
Yeah. I mean, one last question just on this fact, just right now, September 21st, when you know so many of these people who were at the Justice Department and following the White House counsel's office at the second and third levels, which are still very high levels, of course. We only know people from the outside who watch. We know the name of the White House counsel. We know Barr. We don't really follow who's Assistant Attorney General for this or that. I remember at the time we talked in 2017, you had a high opinion, basically, of a lot of the people at that, let's call it, very important second tier, which really runs a huge chunk of the Justice Department. Has that eroded some, or do you continue to be pretty okay with that?
It's a tough call to make. I mean, the people that I know, in one of my successors, Steve Engel, at OLC, people in the White House counsels and senior positions who I've worked with in government. I mean, these are people that I believe are full of integrity and, they have a job. I have not seen them. People will criticize some of their opinions. Engel's opinions get criticized as going too far in the direction of presidential power. But frankly, that's just a typical, I don't think he's done anything out of the unusual in the OLC role. I think he's done a good job under remarkably difficult circumstances. Not everyone would agree with me on that. White House counsel's office, that's a tricky one because they really, they were involved in going to bat for the president. And I'm not going to cast aspersions on the integrity of anyone in that office, but some friends and acquaintances I have working there, I just worry about them every day. And being a lawyer for this president, who views lawyers basically the way mobsters view criminal lawyers, or very instrumentally. He's always viewed lawyers very instrumentally, and Trump has always viewed the law as something to manipulate or circumvent. He's the worst and most difficult of all clients. And I imagine that these people whom I admire, and if I were there, and I wouldn't have lasted 2 days, but if I were there and I stayed there, your job is in a way to figure out what the right executive branch principle is. And this is one of the things that Trump has kind of stirred up. There are important principles of executive power that it's the job of those lawyers to defend. It's extremely difficult to do so when Donald Trump is your client doing all these crazy things, but that's their job. And if maybe they should resign. And that's a personal judgment choice. But I don't question their integrity, and the people I know in any event are, first-rate lawyers.
I mean, I would say in some of the parts of government I know a little about, and know people who are still in or who have come out, and with whom I've dealt in the last few months. Sometimes in terms of some of them have come out against Trump's reelection, and I've dealt with them in that context. Others just private conversations. But at education, HHS, other parts of the government, and not lawyers, so it's like different relationship. But these are these are chiefs of staff, heads of subordinate parts of the agencies, and so forth.
Right.
And I think we've seen some of this in terms of the pandemic, in terms of parts of HHS in particular. I do think there's been an equivalent kind of pressure, an equivalent erosion, frankly, of the kind of independence and standing of certain people, an equivalent attempt by some people to sort of man the barricades, as it were. But it's gotten harder and harder. Now, again, maybe we've seen what's happened and then nothing more really can be done, though I don't know. I mean, do we have the kind of confidence we once would have had that it's out of the question that, a vaccine will be overly prematurely announced and overly hyped on November 1st? I kind of would have said, frankly, a year ago, oh, come on, that can't happen. This is one of the most norm-embedded parts of the federal government, right? I mean, all these independent scientists and, huge parts of the private sector depend on them being straight, and so they can make mistakes, but not, be politicized quite in this way. But I don't know. So that's, I think, the other part of it too.
Listen, I will just tell you from personal experience, it's the hardest thing in the world to know how to draw these lines. It seems easy from the outside. You're serving a president,
totally,
and you are there, at least as lawyers. I can't speak for the scientists. You're there to not be a lackey, but to figure out, where the law is and what the range of presidential prerogative is. And it's very hard to draw the line of when the president goes too far and is acting outlandishly. A lot of Trump's outlandishness, this is the problem, is not kind of overt legal violation. It's norm violation. But when you're advising that kind of a president legally, it's very tough. And I imagine what these people are doing is putting their heads down and saying, we're just going to basically ignore the context and give legal advice as if this were a normal president.
Yeah,
and that can be criticized, but that's what they're doing, I think.
Yeah, and I was thinking not so much only the legal advice, but I think if you're head of the FDA and you think you can keep the agency going on track, and it's very important, of course, to have a well-functioning FDA. If you're in the middle of a pandemic, you'll do a few things that you would prefer not to do in terms of some public statements and but that's the price you pay. And then, of course, some people have been unwilling to pay that price and have left. But I am struck talking to the people I've talked to privately, how much pressure they've been under and how unnerved they are by what they're experiencing day to day.
I completely agree. I'll just repeat what you said in different terms. This is the way I understand it. It's, you always have to make small compromises. You don't always. You often have to make small compromises at the margins when you're in these jobs. You want to do the right thing. There are certain principles you won't give up, but you're put in these awkward positions, and to gain the principle that you think is important and to see that it's vindicated, sometimes you just have to, appear next to the president in a way that's awkward, or say something, or give in to something. And you can't be principled all the way down. You do serve a president. Drawing that line is very hard. And I imagine a lot of these people think, I want to stay here and do the right thing. I want to stay here and see the right principles through, the right results through. And I imagine they're taking personal hits these are personal, maybe diminutions of reputation or personal hits and integrity to, ultimately do the right thing. It's just a very difficult position to be in. The easy thing to do is resign, frankly.
Yeah.
And and the question whether one should resign or stay on and do one's best it's just very, very hard. I can't imagine a more difficult president to work for.
Yeah, I think that's true from the people I've talked to. I mean, just recently, a woman, Olivia Troy, who was Vice President Pence staffer for the whole coronavirus task force, resigned, not until late, really tried to make it work. She's a career intelligence and homeland security type, and tried to make it work. And it was hard for her to resign because she thought she was doing a good job. And I think a lot of other people would say she was, who I've now spoken to, since but she just felt she couldn't sort of manage it anymore. But others are still there, obviously. Yeah. So it is tough.
But she did it for a long time. And I'm sure, I think she may have said this in speech, I can't remember. I'm sure that every day when she was there, she was struggling with this point.
Yeah.
And it's very tough.
It is. What about Congress? One last thing, I think maybe on the more separation of power side, looks to me, not being at all expert in this, that Trump is, again, pushing further than previous administrations have and not cooperating with Congress, not providing information and testimony in a way that's kind of routine? Or do you take that as how serious do you think that whole side of things is?
I mean, he played probably greater hardball on information during the impeachment stuff than Clinton did. The general resistance of congressional subpoenas is a standard practice in the executive branch. The way that, I'm not saying in every instance, but it's a standard, there's a standard dance that you go through. And I would say that Trump's ultimate position was probably a little more forward-leaning in the sense that there's supposed to be an accommodation process by both sides. And then, and that's kind of the norm, so to speak. And you start off with extreme positions, and then you kind of gravitate and compromise towards some accommodation. That's what the term of art is. And they didn't engage in that accommodation process. Basically, they took the extreme position to start with, and then they didn't really seriously engage in the accommodation process. They litigated it. They nominally lost in the Supreme Court on the Missouri case about the Congress being able to get the president's tax records. They lost the legal issue, but it's not clear they really lost the legal issue. The court, it was kind of a split decision, even though the court came together in a basically near unanimous bipartisan judgment. I read that opinion as ultimately the president, he carved out an extreme legal position, and the court rejected the extreme legal position. But as it often happens, when they reject the extreme legal position, they go back to a position that's still kind of favorable to the president. We're not going to know how that opinion works out until we see how it's applied in the future. But yes, I think that they did not, I would say two things stick out to me. They didn't take the accommodation side of the process as seriously. The reaction to the impeachment, that letter from the White House counsel, was like nothing I'd seen in any other impeachment letter. It looked like it was drafted by Trump in terms of there was just no respect at all. It was kind of scorched earth. And, that's the way they operate. And that's the way they operate in everything. And so that was a little different. But I think we shouldn't, I'm not saying you're doing this. There's a little bit of selective recollection about the extent to which the Obama administration and the Bush administration pushed back against the congressional subpoenas in various contexts. I mean, Attorney General Holder, I think, was censured by the Congress.
Yeah, or the House at least, yeah.
The House for his refusal to, I think, turn over documents about Fast and Furious. Yeah. And again, I'm not drawing an exact parallel. I'm just saying that the truth is these disputes are typical, and maybe the Trump people pushed a little harder than usual.
So where do we stand? Let's assume, I think, unless you want to talk about the next 6 weeks or the election night and all that kind of post-election possible nightmare scenarios, which I've done a little work on, but I think that's been pretty well covered by a lot of other people.
It's been covered by people more competent than me. Every time I look at it, I get depressed, and I don't see how it can turn out well, but I'm not an expert on that.
So January 21st, let's just assume it's Biden for now. How optimistic are you? Where do you think we stand in terms, I guess I would say, of institutions and then of norms and broader political culture? And what are the big things that could or should happen?
So I've just written a book about this, and the book lays out really over 50 reforms, over 14 chapters, talking about a whole number of topics. It's basically a kind of roadmap for how to restructure the presidency, to put it on basically the equivalent footing of the reforms in the 70s that it put the presidency on. Those reforms worked for a while, but they've now run their course, and we now see a lot of gaps and problems in those reforms, not all of which are attributable to Trump. I mean, some of these things, and our chapters go through the history in each one of these areas, whether from vacancies or war powers or special counsel or independence or the pardon power. All of these things have prehistories, pre-Trump histories. And so there's a lot potentially to be done. And the book we wrote, we basically think it all needs to be done. It won't all be done. So, I mean, one way I would get at this is to say, first thing is, independent of any reforms we propose in the book, the most important factor is going to be the attitude of the next president towards this issue. You know, like Ford and especially Carter in the 70s, it was an issue item for them, and they expended political capital, and it was part of their operating governance program to restore norms and legal constraints and legal accountability to the presidency, especially Carter. And the attorney generals, Griffin Bell and Edward Levy, Griffin Bell for Carter and Edward Levy for Ford. Hugely important that those two men were the attorney general because they were committed to restoring these norms. So the most important factor before we
creating new ones in a way, right?
Yeah, they were actually creating new norms, yes.
Right.
And there will be some new norms that need to be created now. But the point is that those men were very consequential in making a decision. I'm going to expend political capital. This is an important thing for the country to do, and put constraints on the Justice Department, put constraints on the presidency, put constraints on White House DOJ relations and the like. So whether we have a president and an attorney general like we did in the 70s is the most important factor in whether we're going to have serious reform of the presidency. And if it's Joe Biden, I think actually Joe Biden's basic commitments on this, he said to himself, he said at a speech the other day, I'm a constitutionalist, by which he means I think he takes this stuff seriously. He certainly took it seriously when he was in the Senate. Whether that's the Joe Biden who would be president in January, and whether he would have that as a priority, and whether he would have people around him that would have that as a priority, I don't know. Who his attorney general is hugely important for these matters. So that's the first thing and the most important thing about whether something that the kind of gaps and problems in the presidency that have been exposed in the last 4 years will be addressed. And then there's just an issue item of things. I mean, some of them are easier to do than others. Some of them are more important than others. Not all of them will happen. I will tell you that a good chunk of the reforms we propose in our book are being considered on Capitol Hill. And there's serious interest, at least on the Democratic side, in doing a lot of what I think of as low-hanging fruit reform, things like tax returns, things like subjecting the president. The president has been subject to norms, not law, on tax returns and conflict of interest and things like that. That needs to be put on a strict legal basis now. Seems like that kind of reform shouldn't be too hard to do. Another wild card, and then I'll be quiet for a second. Another wild card is what the Republicans are going to do. Right now they're not interested in these reforms because it's aimed at their president. But a lot of these reforms are natural issues for the Republicans. Republicans shouldn't be interested in allowing the president of the United States to corruptly intermingle his private businesses with his public office. They shouldn't be terribly interested. I don't see why they would want to defend a principle that the president doesn't have to disclose his tax returns. I'm sorry. So another wild card is how much and on what issues are the Republicans going to be interested in reform? About half of the reforms we have in mind are executive branch reforms that can be done inside the executive branch, and about half require Congress.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've read the book and I very much agree with. I'm not really confident to judge all the details, but it seems almost entirely correct to me. I do have the sense that an awful lot could be accomplished by just having both a president who takes this stuff seriously, an attorney general who does, an attitude and a sense of we're not here to exploit every nook and cranny of where we can exploit, and then go even further. We want to come, back to or reestablish or establish anew in some cases a sort of not interfering in criminal cases, and sort of all the kind of, let's say, normal aspects of how an executive branch has been run. And it sounds like you do think. I mean, I have friends who are, we absolutely need to reform the Vacancies Act first thing, and it probably should be reformed, just looking at what's happened. Yeah. But on the other hand, I guess you also have the sense that some of these legal things are sort of secondary to a president acting in good faith, or do you think some of these really are essential in terms of the actual?
Yeah, there's so many reforms. I'll get to vacancies in a second. As you said, and I'll just repeat, the character of the people and how they comport themselves and the norms that they articulate in terms of the values they articulate just in the way they talk and act are hugely important. I mean, are you asking me what's the most
Well, not,
important thing
yeah,
to
I
do?
guess I would say so. If Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, and let's just make it bipartisan, because why do the Republicans have any stake in having a strong president if Biden's president, right? So let's assume the four leaders call you in and say, okay, look, we can't do all 50 of these things, Jack and Bob Bauer, your co-author. What two or three would you put from from the change of law point of view, would you say are most important to sort of fix the problems that Trump has exposed?
Yeah. So, unfortunately, the things that I think are easiest are not necessarily the most important. The easiest things are tax disclosure, conflict of interest, maybe interference in foreign elections. Vacancies reform is going to be much harder because the new president is not going to have much of an interest in that. Obama and Bush before him also exploited the vacancies process. Trump, of course, took it to new extremes. But that's a fundamental issue that they're going to have to deal with at some point, and Congress really in a bipartisan way is not happy with that. The Vacancies Reform Act of 1998 turns out to be not a great law, to have lots of loopholes. It definitely needs to be updated. There's a possibility for a deal that we talk about in the book where the executive branch gives up some of the flexibility it has on appointments in exchange for Congress has gotten out of control in the numbers of people who have to receive appointments, and they're always very late on it. So there's a deal to have fewer political appointees, but have the president have less discretion to manipulate that process in between confirmations. That's very hard, I think, to do. The war power stuff, whatever you think about the war power stuff, anything involving war powers is going to be very hard to do. I think emergency powers needs to be reformed, but and Congress will want to reform that. And there's actually some bipartisan sentiment on that. Senator Lee, for example, it's been a big issue for him on the Republican side. But that's something, again, maybe an enlightened president will want to have a serious rethink of emergency power. But by the way, emergency power is not really emergency power. I mean, sometimes it's power in emergencies, but most of emergency power is basically thinking about the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is the main statute presidents deploy. It's really kind of any important foreign policy situation where the president wants to exercise economic sanctions. It basically gives them free rein to do so without much limit. That's going to be a very hard. The reason that's hard to pull back is because because it requires Congress to actually step up and take a more responsible role in monitoring the president. There should be time limits, but that means Congress is going to have to vote on it over time. And the essential problem with a lot of these reforms is that they require Congress to remain involved, and that institution is also broken. So
that's what strikes me. I mean, how worried should one be about that going forward? The ambition was supposed to counteract ambition. It hasn't very well, it would seem to me, over the last 4 years. Maybe that's partly a partisanship trumps institutional ambition, and that might change, I suppose. But I mean, the fixing of Congress agenda would seem to be kind of important too, right?
Yeah, we say in the first chapter of the book, we could have written a different, you might argue that you shouldn't start with the presidency. You should start with elections in Congress if you're going to reform the problems of the country. And I do think that, I definitely do think that we have a system now, our separation of power system has devolved such that we have an aggressive executive and an aggressive executive and aggressive courts making law effectively within their relevant institutions, and Congress is just out of the game.
Yeah.
And it's obviously upends the way it was supposed to work. There are a lot of reasons for it. It's been a long time coming. It's why Obama, when he couldn't work with Congress, he got really aggressive on his regulations. It's why it's one of the reasons Bush went the kind of go it alone route in terms of disregarding congressional statutes. I'm not justifying either one of those, but it's a serious, serious problem at the core of all of this. It's possible, I think, if the Democrats win both houses of Congress, to get a one-time shot reform on a lot of these issues that don't necessarily involve ongoing congressional participation. But some of these reforms require Congress to step up and take more of a role on an ongoing basis. You can't reform emergency powers, for example. Basically, reforms of emergency powers, which are out of control with the president, require Congress both to tighten up the delegations and to take an ongoing role, either with a sunset clause where they have to vote on it every year or every 6 months or whatever, or some kind of very heavy involvement and oversight. And those things are just hard to imagine right now, frankly. This was what your point is.
I mean, how much, I guess, so stepping back, do you think, so my pessimistic friends are sort of, it's been a tit for tat. It's going to keep on being a tit for tat. Congress doesn't want to govern. There are no incentives for them to be responsible. No, not that many incentives for a president to even be responsible in terms of the executive branch. It's all on a bad path. It has been for a while, versus maybe this has been a wake-up call. There's certainly a lot more talk among, I'd say on the left, but maybe not so much on the right. Maybe that'll change if Trump loses, about, gee, we need to have, like, whatever happened to the Constitution and whatever happened to these norms, and all of the norms which progressives were sort of busy to some degree tossing aside in the interest of greater progress, suddenly are become things that they appeal to an awful lot. Maybe that's just a temporary thing. But I mean, how optimistic are you that you could have a kind of new, kind of almost constitutionalist, institutionalist culture, and how pessimistic that that's something that people like us would like, but it gets quickly swamped in a kind of in the back and forth?
Yeah. So I'm worried about that. I think that's a likely possibility. Again, it depends on which reforms we're talking about. I think some of these things are kind of easy. I don't see why. So I agree, and I'm going to say more about this in a second, that there's this general tit for tat downward norm breaking spiral. And we can talk later about the Supreme Court appointments, where that is going to, what's going on with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing and her replacement. That's going to impact what we're talking about now, and we can talk about that later if you want. But I'm pessimistic because the general atmosphere is as you describe it, and I have every reason to think that Democrats, when they get in power, they're going to want to grab all the power and not be self-constrained in reaction to Trump doing that. And there's a lot of political pressure from within their party to do that. And by the way, Trump was doing that because it was a reaction to what they perceived from prior administrations. I mean, it's a tit for tat, and people are seeing it in a one-sided way, and it's to the long-term detriment of them all. But everyone now in Washington is going for short-term power gains. And so that is the mindset, and it is a real hurdle to reform. So again, I'll just say two things that I've already said. One, some of these issues should be easy. There's just shouldn't, some of these issues where there were clear norms that are still good norms need to be embodied in law. I'm thinking about conflict of interest, tax disclosure, maybe foreign interference in elections. We haven't talked about the pardon power yet, but I think it's quite possible to have some reforms at the edges of the pardon power that the Biden administration will be able to accept. There are some things that I think are achievable. Other things, when it comes to, some of the, if you worry about excessive delegations to the president and really trying to push back on that, if you worry about war powers being excessively delegated to the president, if you worry about vacancies reform is going to be hard. It's going to be very hard for Biden to go in there and, given this pressure to grab power and accomplish things, to say, no, we're actually going to restrain ourselves the way presidents did in the 70s. That's why I said at the beginning, the real question is going to be how the people at the top of the Biden administration, if they win, how much this issue is going to matter to them. I know for some people it will matter a lot, but then there are a lot of political calculations on the other end. And the truth is, I'm pessimistic on those issues for the reasons that you described.
Yeah, let's not discuss the next 6 weeks fight over Justice Ginsburg's seat, because who knows what's going to happen. We just passed away two and a half days ago, and B, unless you want to say anything in particular, just get us even more pessimistic, which would be bad for our viewers, I suppose. But
Ross Douthat had a column yesterday that I kind of liked and was thinking to myself, so it's going to be very bad. I'll just say we all know that whatever happens is going to be deeply, deeply contentious and hysterical on both sides, and stakes are huge. And his basic point was that there's an argument for Trump to push ahead, because ultimately the pushback from the Democrats and the reaction and the overt politicization of the court may ultimately diminish the court. And that would be a good thing. I do think that the reason that we're having hysteria over judicial appointments is a clear sign that the court has pushed itself
Right.
too far to the center of American life in deciding issues. And so these confirmation battles become proxies for huge array of policy issues that are kind of outside the democratic process. So if all of this mess that we're about to experience could somehow, as he theorized, result in either because of pushback against the court, stripping of jurisdiction, packing the court's diminished role, or the court just saying we need to lie low for a while. If it took the court away from the center of American political life, that would be a good outcome, but that's pretty hopeful.
Yeah, it's possible, I think, that you could have, as I think we've seen the Chief Justice do a little bit over the last several years, others on the court, disappoint the hopes of their backers, either if it's a Trump appointee who's confirmed or not, or a Biden appointee who's confirmed later, and it's sort of, which might be healthy, but that doesn't seem, that would be looking around the corner. It might happen, I guess, but
maybe. But anyway, before we get there, it's going to be very bad.
Tell me, just one final thing. We should let you go, but I just hadn't really focused on the notion that you stressed, which is that Ford and Carter were very important, and their attorneys general. I mean, I guess now that you say it, it seems not obvious, but makes sense. And maybe the reaction against Nixon meant that anyone would have been that way a little bit, I guess. But Carter, of course, didn't have to be that way. I'm just curious. I mean, what if you, in doing the research for the book and reading up on that period, just say a little more about that. I'm just very struck by that.
I mean, I don't want to.
And Ed Levy and Griffin Bell, I suppose, names names that aren't thrown around all the time, but maybe they should be, right? I mean, yeah.
Well, we don't have Ed Levy's and Griffin Bells anymore. I mean, the only close equivalent to those kind of really more or less as much as you can get apolitical attorney generals who were really interested first and foremost in the rule of law and the reputation of the Justice Department and for rule of law values. I mean, obviously when Levy went in there, he was called in as a man of integrity to clean up the Justice Department, whose reputation had been completely soiled. The two attorney generals had gone to jail or were on their way. And I mean, for the last couple of books I've written, I've had to look more deeply than before at the Watergate and Nixon period. And the levels of corruption at the Justice Department were just completely astonishing. It was really out of control. And so they came in, Levy came in, and look, Ford vetoed some things. And of course, Rumsfeld and Cheney were in the White House trying to bat away the congressional reforms. But Levy established a whole bunch of guidelines that are still with us on Justice Department independence. He established a whole bunch of principles and norms about the way the department should comport itself. Carter comes.
Now, Levy had been, just to clarify for people who don't remember, I mean, had been, I guess, Dean of Chicago Law School. Is that right?
He was the Dean of Chicago Law School. I think he may have even been the president of Chicago Law School at that point. I can't remember, but he was the Dean of Chicago Law School.
Maybe he was president of the university too. I can't remember.
That's right. President of the university, but he was definitely Dean of the law school before then. Yeah.
But not a terribly political person, right? So it would be, I mean, I'm trying, the equivalent today would be, I'm not sure who, Biden making his attorney general a university president or dean who was not particularly associated with I think he was considered a moderate Republican, but very moderate, I think. Yeah.
And also kind of, but I was talking to my co-author about this. We tried to imagine who those people are today.
Yeah.
And it's not, it's not clear who those people are. It's not clear we have a culture that produces, we're split in the legal world is split into the Federalist Society and the ACS. It's kind of politicized all the way down, and the kind of men and women of unquestioned integrity who haven't been involved in politics but who can do the job well. I mean, it's not clear we have as big a pool of people like that, and it's also not clear that presidents in the post-Watergate era are interested in having those people. I mean, having a loyal attorney general is important for the president. That's why they choose the people that they choose, which is unfortunate but true.
And Griffin Bell had been a judge, right? I mean,
he'd been a judge, and he was also, I think, an attorney for Carter. He knew Carter very well, but Carter, of course, ran on this squeaky clean campaign, and Bell came in with clear directions to establish new norms within the department. And so he went even further than Levy did. And, the model of OLC was really detached and independent from the attorney general more so than. And I'm not saying, I'm not being naive and saying they were never cared about politics. Of course they did to some extent. You can't have that job and not care about politics. But they really comported themselves in a way and came in with a reputation such that they were widely respected across the aisle. Can you imagine that now? An attorney general widely respected across the political aisle? It's just almost impossible to imagine. And that's actually kind of a mark of how different things are and how hard it is. Even if you have people in the Justice Department acting with perfect integrity, in the politicized world, it's always winners and losers, good and evil. And so it's not even clear that how a Griffin Bell or an Ed Levy would succeed today, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I know, very much so. And I was thinking, and even Reagan, who then came in as a very ideological candidate for president, obviously, my impression is that at least in his first term, a lot of political types in the White House, to say the least, but that that the Justice Department stayed on that track mostly under.
Well, William French Smith, yes, but there was the Civil Rights Division was very controversial.
That's true. True.
Brad Reynolds and I'm not saying they were wrong. They were just very, very controversial.
That's true. They were controversial. But
and Meese was giving those speeches when he became Attorney General,
right,
kind of pushing the conservative view on executive power and interpretation. They were pretty forward-leaning in ways that I'm not saying they didn't abide by the norms. They actually continued the norms that Levy and Griffin put in place, but it wasn't the same feeling.
No, and I suppose that the reaction to Iran-Contra then, which sort of reestablished in a funny way those norms, you could argue at least in the sense of you can't do this. You can't have a rogue foreign policy that ignores congressional appropriations. Maybe reestablish them for a while. I guess it's always been a little more tenuous than one realizes when one looks back. There were plenty of times.
Well, there are always different situations. I mean, that was less about White House DOJ relations than about the intelligence community and the covert action process. But then again, that it showed holes in the accountability of that process that they thought they'd fixed after Watergate and they didn't. So it did lead to new reforms. And that process has been a lot better ever since because of that. It's an ongoing project, obviously.
Right. But it seems like it's an important moment for it in the next few months. Well, you and Bob Bauer should become co-attorneys general and have a bipartisan reform agenda, or maybe they could put you in charge of a commission or something. I mean, that sort of looks at these things.
I doubt seriously that's going to happen, but it's been a joy to work with him. I mean, we don't agree politically on things, but he's a great man, and we've really tried to wrestle with these issues to try to find I'll just say one more thing and then we can stop. We tried to be guided by the principle that we would accept restrictions on a president that we would accept if we had our preferred president, and we would accept discretion in a president if it were given to a president that we didn't admire. I mean, that was our kind of guiding principle, and that's not a perfect guide, but I think it's a pretty good way to think about these reforms, and that kind of guided us throughout. And it was a very useful exercise to work through that with him.
No, and I think it's great that you did it, honestly. I hadn't really planned to think about this at the end of our conversation, but I mean, the fact that you did this in a way is a bit of an example of what could happen. So let's hope people follow in your and Bob's footsteps.
We thought about that, but I'm not very hopeful. I'm not very hopeful.
That's a good note to end on here, a realistic note. But anyway, we'll keep hope alive, and we'll have this conversation another one in a year and discuss
see where things
are. That'll be very interesting.
Great.
Jack Goldsmith, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Bill.
On Conversations, and thank you all for joining us.